It was a clear Tuesday morning in the United States. September 11th, 2001 began like any ordinary day. Millions of people were commuting to work. Children were arriving at school classrooms. No one knew history was about to change. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. The impact shocked New York City. Smoke poured from the upper floors. Many people believed it was an accident. Television networks began live coverage. 17 minutes later, another plane appeared. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The world realized America was under attack. Panic spread across the city. Office workers rushed toward stairwells. Firefighters raced into the burning towers. Police sealed off surrounding streets. Thousands were trapped above the impact zones. Emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. News anchors struggled to understand what was happening. At 9:37 a.m., another plane struck the Pentagon. The headquarters of the U.S. military was hit. Thick smoke rose over Washington, D.C. The attack confirmed a coordinated assault. Air traffic control grounded flights. Nationwide, U.S. airspace shut down for the first time in history. Meanwhile, a fourth plane had been hijacked. Passengers learned about the attacks through phone calls. They realized their plane was part of the plot. The passengers decided to fight back. A struggle broke out inside the cockpit. United Flight 93 crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Their actions likely saved countless lives. Back in New York, the fires burned uncontrollably. Structural damage weakened the towers. Rescue teams continued climbing upward. People descended through smoke-filled staircases. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. A massive cloud of debris engulfed Manhattan. First responders were buried in dust and rubble. Shock and disbelief spread worldwide. Television viewers watched in horror. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. Lower Manhattan disappeared under smoke and ash. The skyline of New York was forever changed. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. Thousands more were injured. Families searched for missing loved ones. Hospitals prepared for mass casualties. Rescue workers began digging through debris. Firefighters worked without rest. Volunteers arrived to help however they could. The nation entered a state of shock. Air travel halted across the country. Military bases moved to high alert. The president was rushed to secure locations. Security fears spread across major cities. Americans gathered around televisions. The attacks dominated global headlines. World leaders expressed solidarity with the United States. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time. It declared the attack an assault on all member nations. Investigators began searching for answers. Attention quickly turned to Al-Qaeda. The group was led by Osama bin Laden. He had declared war on the United States years earlier. Intelligence agencies traced the hijackers' movements. Evidence revealed a complex global network. The attacks shocked the world into a new era. Security priorities changed overnight. Airports introduced strict screening measures. Surveillance laws expanded. Fear of future attacks spread globally. The phrase war on terror soon emerged. The United States prepared to respond. Military planners began drafting strategies. Afghanistan quickly became the focus. The Taliban regime sheltered Al-Qaeda leaders. America demanded their surrender. Diplomatic pressure increased. The world watched closely. War now seemed inevitable. A new chapter of global conflict was about to begin. After the September 11th attacks, the United States demanded justice. America wanted those responsible held accountable. Intelligence agencies identified Al-Qaeda as the group behind the attacks. The organization was led by Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban regime. Women were banned from education and most public life. The regime sheltered extremist groups. Osama bin Laden operated freely under Taliban protection. The United States demanded the Taliban hand him over. Taliban leaders refused. They asked for evidence and negotiations instead. The refusal angered U.S. leadership. President George W. Bush issued a final warning. Hand over the terrorists or face consequences. The Taliban still refused. Diplomatic efforts quickly collapsed. The United States began building an international coalition. NATO allies pledged support. Dozens of nations offered military or logistical assistance. The campaign was named Operation Enduring Freedom. Its mission was to destroy Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. Military planners prepared for war. Afghanistan's mountainous terrain posed major challenges. The country had defeated foreign invaders before. Both the British Empire and the Soviet Union had failed there. U.S. forces studied past conflicts for lessons. Special forces units were deployed first. SEAL teams entered Afghanistan secretly. They made contact with anti-Taliban fighters. These fighters were known as the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance had long opposed Taliban rule. They controlled small areas in northern Afghanistan. U.S. support strengthened their position. On October 7, 2001, the air campaign began. American and British forces launched precision strikes. Cruise missiles targeted Taliban defenses. Airstrikes hit training camps and command centers. Taliban communication networks were disrupted. Al-Qaeda facilities were destroyed. The bombing shocked Taliban forces. Many fighters abandoned their positions. Northern Alliance troops advanced on the ground. U.S. Special Forces coordinated attacks from horseback. Advanced technology guided precision airstrikes. Taliban front lines began collapsing. Major cities started falling one by one. Mazar-e-Sharif fell in November 2001. The victory boosted Northern Alliance momentum. Taliban control weakened rapidly. Kabul, the capital, was soon abandoned. Taliban leaders fled the city. Northern Alliance forces entered Kabul. Residents welcomed the end of Taliban rule. Music returned to streets once silenced. Women cautiously returned to public life. Schools reopened for girls. International media showed images of celebration. However, the Taliban were not defeated completely. Many fighters escaped into rural areas. Others crossed into neighboring Pakistan. Osama bin Laden remained at large. U.S. forces intensified their search. Intelligence pointed toward the Tora Bora Mountains. The region was filled with caves and tunnels. It had been used by fighters for decades. Coalition forces launched operations to capture bin Laden. Heavy bombing targeted cave complexes. Al-Qaeda fighters resisted fiercely. Harsh winter conditions complicated the battle. Many militants escaped through mountain routes. Bin Laden slipped away. The failure to capture him frustrated U.S. leaders. Still, the Taliban government had collapsed. A new Afghan government began forming. International forces arrived to stabilize the country. The mission shifted from invasion to rebuilding. But insurgency was already beginning to grow. The war in Afghanistan was far from over. After the fall of Kabul, one objective remained: capture Osama bin Laden. Intelligence reports placed him in eastern Afghanistan. The region was dominated by rugged mountains. One area stood out: Tora Bora. Tora Bora means black cave in the local language. The mountains were filled with tunnels and bunkers. Many caves dated back to the Soviet-Afghan War. Fighters had expanded the tunnel systems for defense. The terrain made traditional warfare difficult. Narrow passes limited vehicle movement. Winter snow added to the challenge. U.S. forces relied heavily on local Afghan fighters. These militias knew the terrain better than anyone. American Special Forces coordinated the operation. CIA offices helped gather real-time intelligence. Drone surveillance monitored cave entrances. Coalition aircraft bombed suspected hideouts. Explosions echoed through the mountains. Al-Qaeda fighters fortified their positions. They used tunnels to avoid airstrikes. Coalition forces advanced slowly uphill. Heavy resistance slowed their progress. Al-Qaeda fighters used machine guns and mortars. The steep terrain made every step dangerous. Communication was difficult in the mountains. Radio signals were often disrupted. Night operations added further risk. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers endured exhaustion and frostbite. Despite the harsh conditions, the offensive continued. Intelligence suggested bin Laden was nearby. Captured fighters confirmed his presence. Coalition commanders increased bombing intensity. Massive bunker-busting bombs were deployed. Cave systems collapsed under repeated strikes. Smoke poured from shattered tunnel entrances. Yet resistance did not stop. Al-Qaeda fighters launched counterattacks. Close-range firefights broke out in narrow paths. Afghan militias led assaults on cave positions. U.S. forces provided covering fire. Progress remained slow and costly. Meanwhile, escape routes remained open. The Pakistan border was only miles away. Mountain trails provided hidden pathways. Some commanders urged sealing the border. Limited troop numbers made it difficult. Afghan allies were tasked with blocking escape routes. Not all checkpoints held their positions. Gaps in the perimeter began to appear. Reports suggested militants were slipping through. Night movement made detection difficult. Snowfall covered tracks and trails. Bin Laden's inner circle moved constantly. Messages were carried by trusted couriers. Electronic communication was avoided. Coalition forces closed in on major cave complexes. Many fighters surrendered. Others chose to fight to the death. Some detonated explosives to avoid capture. The battle raged for weeks. Coalition forces captured large weapon caches. Documents and computers were recovered. Intelligence revealed Al-Qaeda's global network. Despite successes, bin Laden remained missing. Reports indicated he had escaped into Pakistan. The news frustrated American leadership. The world questioned how he slipped away. Tora Bora became a symbol of unfinished victory. Al-Qaeda had been weakened, but not destroyed. Surviving fighters scattered across the region. Many regrouped in remote tribal areas. The hunt for bin Laden continued. U.S. forces expanded intelligence operations. New counter-terror strategies were developed. Afghanistan remained unstable. Taliban fighters began reorganizing. Insurgent attacks slowly increased. The war was shifting into a new phase. The longest manhunt in modern history had begun. By 2002, the Taliban had lost control of Afghanistan. Many leaders fled across the border into Pakistan. Others blended into rural Afghan villages. Coalition forces believed the war was nearly over. But the Taliban were not defeated. They began reorganizing in remote regions. Safe havens formed in mountainous border areas. Fighters regrouped and recruited new members. Tribal networks provided shelter and support. Taliban leaders shifted to guerrilla warfare. They avoided direct battles with coalition forces. Instead, they relied on surprise attacks. Small units struck quickly and disappeared. Hit and run tactics frustrated U.S. troops. Insurgents knew the terrain better than foreign forces. Villages became battlegrounds of influence. Some locals supported coalition forces. Others feared Taliban retaliation. The struggle for loyalty intensified. Insurgents began planting roadside bombs. Improvised explosive devices became a major threat. These hidden bombs targeted patrol vehicles. Convoys traveled under constant danger. Soldiers learned to scan roads for disturbances. Even small debris could hide explosives. Night attacks began causing heavy casualties. Insurgents recorded attacks for propaganda. Videos were distributed to inspire recruits. Taliban messaging spread through mosques and radio. They portrayed themselves as defenders of Islam. Coalition forces struggled to counter the narrative. Night raids targeted insurgent leaders. Special operations units conducted capture missions. Some high-value targets were eliminated. Others quickly replaced fallen commanders. The insurgency adapted rapidly. Taliban fighters avoided technology tracking. They used couriers instead of electronic communication. This made intelligence gathering difficult. Cross-border movement remained a major challenge. Fighters crossed into Pakistan to evade pursuit. Political tensions, complicated cross-border operations. NATO forces expanded their presence. More countries deployed troops to Afghanistan. International forces took responsibility for different regions. British troops operated in Helmand province. Canadian forces deployed to German troops managed security in northern areas. Coordination among allies became essential. Insurgent attacks increased each year. Suicide bombings began appearing in cities. Markets and government buildings were targeted. Fear spread among civilians. Reconstruction efforts faced constant disruption. Roads, schools, and clinics were attacked. Aid workers became targets. Many humanitarian groups withdrew staff. Development projects slowed dramatically. Afghan security forces began training programs. The goal was to build a national army. Police forces were also restructured. Corruption and poor training limited effectiveness. Taliban fighters exploited these weaknesses. Assassinations targeted local officials. Government authority weakened in rural areas. Insurgents established shadow governments. They enforced their own rules and taxes. Coalition forces launched clearing operations. Villages were searched for weapons and fighters. Insurgents often returned after troops left. The war became a cycle of control and loss. Civilian casualties increased resentment. Winning local trust became more difficult. Taliban influence continued expanding. Violence spread into previously secure regions. The conflict transformed into a long insurgency. Quick victory was no longer possible. Military leaders adjusted their strategies. Counterinsurgency became the new focus. Afghanistan was entering a prolonged war. By 2005, violence in Afghanistan was rising sharply. Taliban fighters had regained strength. Insurgent groups expanded recruitment. Young men were drawn by ideology, money, or revenge. Taliban influence spread across southern provinces. Helmand and Kandahar became conflict hotspots. NATO forces increased patrols in unstable areas. Insurgents responded with more coordinated attacks. Ambushes targeted military convoys. Roadside bombs became increasingly sophisticated. Remote detonators replaced simple triggers. Coalition vehicles faced constant danger. Armored vehicles were introduced for protection. Even heavily armored trucks were not always safe. Suicide bombings surged during this period. These attacks were previously rare in Afghanistan. Insurgents targeted checkpoints and military bases. Government offices became frequent targets. Afghan civilians were often caught in the blasts. Fear spread in urban centers. Kabul experienced a rise in deadly attacks. Markets and public spaces were no longer safe. Taliban propaganda framed attacks as resistance. Videos and recordings spread through underground networks. Recruiters used these messages to attract fighters. Cross-border supply routes remained active. Weapons flowed through smuggling networks. Insurgents gained access to advanced explosives. Foreign fighters joined the conflict. Some came from neighboring regions. Others traveled from distant countries. NATO forces struggled to secure remote territories. Mountain regions remained insurgent strongholds. Clearing operations often met fierce resistance. Insurgents planted explosives before retreating. Civilian casualties strained local relationships. Villagers sometimes blamed foreign troops. Taliban exploited this resentment. They presented themselves as protectors. Night letters warned locals against cooperation. Threats discouraged collaboration with government forces. Assassinations targeted tribal leaders. Teachers and aid workers were also attacked. Schools were burned to prevent education programs. Girls' schools were frequent targets. Reconstruction projects slowed dramatically. Roads and bridges were destroyed by insurgents. Supply routes became difficult to maintain. NATO increased troop deployments. British forces intensified operations in Helmand. Heavy fighting erupted in rural districts. Canadian troops faced intense battles and insurgents used irrigation canals as defensive trenches. Snipers targeted soldiers from hidden positions. Dust storms reduced visibility during operations. Night combat increased in frequency. Taliban fighters used darkness to their advantage. Coalition forces adopted night vision technology. Special forces targeted bomb-making networks. Several key bomb makers were captured. Others quickly replaced them. Insurgents adapted their tactics continuously. Improvised explosives became more lethal. Pressure plate bombs targeted foot patrols. Casualties among coalition troops increased. Public support for the war began to decline. Media coverage highlighted growing losses. Military leaders debated new strategies. Counterinsurgency tactics gained renewed focus. Winning civilian trust became a priority. Development projects were paired with security efforts. Provincial reconstruction teams expanded operations. Some communities experienced improved security. Others remained under Taliban influence. The conflict showed no signs of ending. Insurgent attacks continued to rise each year. Coalition forces prepared for a long fight. Afghanistan had become a central front in the war on terror. The world watched as violence intensified. The war was entering an even more dangerous phase. While fighting continued in Afghanistan, attention shifted to Iraq. The United States accused Iraq of possessing weapons of mass destruction. Officials claimed Saddam Hussein posed a global threat. Iraq was also accused of supporting terrorist organizations. Intelligence reports suggested dangerous weapons programs. The U.S. government warned of catastrophic risks. Diplomatic pressure increased throughout 2002. The United Nations demanded weapons inspections. Inspectors searched suspected facilities across Iraq. No active weapons stockpiles were confirmed. Debate intensified within the international community. Some nations supported military action. Others warned against invasion. Despite disagreement, military preparations continued. U.S. and coalition forces assembled in the Persian Gulf. Hundreds of thousands of troops were deployed. Aircraft carriers moved into strategic positions. Military planners prepared for rapid invasion. On March 20, 2003, the invasion began. Airstrikes targeted government and military facilities. The campaign was called Shock and Awe. Massive bombardment struck Baghdad overnight. Explosions lit the sky across the capital. Iraqi command centers were destroyed. Coalition ground forces advanced quickly. Armored divisions pushed toward Baghdad. Iraqi forces offered uneven resistance. Some units fought fiercely. Others surrendered without battle. Civilians fled combat zones. Major cities fell within weeks. Busra was secured in the south. Coalition forces reached Baghdad in early April. Government control began collapsing. Saddam Hussein's regime crumbled rapidly. On April 9, 2003, Baghdad fell. Images showed Saddam's statue being pulled down. The moment symbolized the regime's fall. Saddam Hussein went into hiding. Coalition forces declared victory in major combat. President George W. Bush announced mission success, but stability did not follow. Government institutions collapsed. Police forces disappeared from the streets. Looting spread across Baghdad. Museums and public buildings were ransacked. Infrastructure was severely damaged. Electricity and water services were disrupted. Public frustration grew quickly. Former soldiers were suddenly unemployed. The Iraqi army had been dissolved. Hundreds of thousands were left without income. Many felt humiliated and angry. Armed groups began forming across the country. Insurgency began emerging in Sunni regions. Roadside bomb attacks targeted coalition forces. Convoys were ambushed in urban areas. Guerrilla warfare tactics spread rapidly. Foreign fighters entered Iraq. Extremist groups exploited instability. One militant leader gained attention. Abu Masab al-Zarqawi led a brutal insurgent network. Sunni and Shia tensions intensified. Religious sites became targets. Civil conflict threatened national unity. Coalition forces faced a growing insurgency. Urban warfare replaced conventional battles. Baghdad became one of the most dangerous cities. Roadside bombs became the leading cause of casualties. Military patrols faced daily attacks. Efforts to rebuild Iraq faced constant disruption. Public support for the war declined internationally. Questions arose about the invasion's justification. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The conflict reshaped global opinion. Iraq became a central battlefield in the war on terror. The war's consequences were only beginning to unfold.
By 2004, Iraq was descending into chaos. Armed insurgent groups spread across the country. Coalition forces faced attacks almost daily. A new extremist network began gaining power. It was led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was a Jordanian militant. He formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The group pledged loyalty to Osama bin Laden. Their tactics were extremely brutal. Suicide bombings became their signature weapon. Attacks targeted police stations and military bases. Civilians were often killed in the blasts. Markets and mosques became frequent targets. Fear spread across Iraqi cities. Sectarian divisions deepened rapidly. Iraq's population was split between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Zarqawi aimed to ignite sectarian war. His group bombed Shia religious sites. One of the deadliest attacks struck in Kabul. Pilgrims were killed during religious gatherings. Anger erupted across Shia communities. Retaliatory violence began escalating. Militias formed to protect neighborhoods. Armed checkpoints appeared across cities. Baghdad became divided by sectarian lines. Concrete barriers separated districts. Death squads operated in the shadows. Kidnappings and executions became common. Bodies appeared daily on city streets. Civilians feared leaving their homes. Religious identity became a life or death factor. Coalition forces struggled to contain the violence. Urban warfare intensified. Insurgents used crowded areas as cover. Roadside bombs targeted patrol routes. Snipers attacked from rooftops. Explosions echoed through Baghdad daily. US forces launched raids against militant leaders. Intelligence operations tracked Zarqawi's network. His fighters used safe houses and hidden cells. Propaganda videos spread online. The videos aimed to recruit and intimidate. Foreign fighters continued entering Iraq. Extremist networks expanded their reach. Coalition supply routes came under constant attack. Convoys required heavy protection. Helicopters became essential for transport. Meanwhile, Iraqi security forces struggled to stabilize the country. Many recruits lacked training and equipment. Some units were infiltrated by militias. Trust in government institutions weakened. Sectarian loyalties often outweighed national unity. In 2006, violence reached a breaking point. The Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra was bombed. The shrine was one of Shia Islam's holiest sites. The attack triggered nationwide outrage. Retaliatory killings surged overnight. Sectarian conflicts spiraled into near-civil war. Entire neighborhoods were emptied of residents. Families fled to safer regions. Refugee numbers climbed rapidly. Baghdad became a city divided by fear. Coalition forces increased patrols and checkpoints. Curfews were imposed to limit violence. Military commanders reassessed their strategy. Capturing Zarqawi became a top priority. Intelligence traced his movements carefully. In June 2006, US airstrikes targeted his safe house. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed in the strike. His death was a major tactical victory. However, the insurgency did not collapse. New leaders quickly replaced him. Extremist networks remained active. Sectarian violence continued despite his death. Iraq remained deeply unstable. Coalition forces prepared new counterinsurgency plans. The conflict had evolved into a complex civil struggle. Violence was no longer just insurgency. It was a battle for Iraq's identity. The war was entering an even darker phase.
By 2006, Iraq was on the brink of full civil war. Sectarian killings had reached catastrophic levels. Baghdad was one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Daily bombings created constant fear. Coalition forces struggled to control the violence. Previous strategies had failed to restore stability. US military leaders proposed a new approach. It became known as a troop surge. President George W. Bush announced the plan in 2007. Over 30,000 additional US troops were deployed. The goal was to secure population centers, protect civilians, and reduce sectarian violence. The strategy emphasized counterinsurgency. Soldiers would live among civilians instead of distant bases. Small outposts were built throughout Baghdad neighborhoods. Troops increased patrols on foot. This created constant security presence. The approach aimed to build local trust. Intelligence gathering improved through community contact. Coalition forces targeted insurgent safe houses. Night raids captured militant leaders. Bomb-making networks were dismantled. Checkpoints limited movement of weapons. Curfews reduced nighttime violence. Walls and barriers separated hostile neighborhoods. Though controversial, barriers reduced sectarian clashes. Local tribal leaders began shifting alliances. Many Sunni tribes opposed Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They formed militias known as the Awakening Councils. These groups cooperated with US forces. They provided intelligence on extremist networks. Their support weakened Al-Qaeda influence. Coalition forces supplied weapons and training. Former insurgents became local security partners. Violence began decreasing in key regions. Markets slowly reopened. Families returned to previously abandoned neighborhoods. Schools resumed operations. Children returned to classrooms. Businesses reopened after years of fear. Baghdad streets showed signs of normal life. Insurgent attacks did not stop entirely. However, their frequency declined. Roadside bomb incidents decreased. Civilian deaths dropped significantly. Coalition casualties also declined. Military commanders called it a turning point. Intelligence operations became more effective. Extremist leaders found fewer safe havens. Al-Qaeda in Iraq lost territorial influence. However, tensions remained beneath the surface. Sectarian mistrust did not disappear overnight. Political reconciliation remained difficult. Iraqi government reforms progressed slowly. Corruption continued to undermine progress. Some militias resisted disarmament efforts. Regional rivalries influenced internal politics. Neighboring countries watched developments closely. Iran expanded influence among Shia political groups. Regional power dynamics became more complex. U.S. commanders debated the long-term sustainability. Maintaining security required continued troop presence. American public opinion remained divided. War fatigue grew at home. Financial costs of the war increased dramatically. Despite improvements, stability remained fragile. Insurgent networks adapted to new conditions. Extremists shifted tactics to survive. Iraq's future remained uncertain. Yet, the surge had reduced widespread violence. Many cities experienced their first calm in years. Coalition forces began planning gradual transitions. Iraqi security forces took larger roles. Training programs expanded nationwide. Responsibility slowly shifted to Iraqi control. The surge showed military force alone was not enough. Political stability remained essential. Iraq was no longer collapsing. But peace was still far from guaranteed. The war on terror continued into its next phase. By 2008, violence in Iraq had declined significantly. The troop surge strategy had reduced large-scale attacks. Al-Qaeda in Iraq lost control of key territories. Local tribes turned against extremist fighters. Awakening councils continued assisting coalition forces. Intelligence sharing improved security operations. Insurgent safe houses were increasingly discovered. Bomb-making networks were dismantled across cities. Civilian deaths dropped compared to previous years. Baghdad slowly returned to daily routine. Markets reopened and traffic returned to streets. Schools and universities resumed regular operations. Reconstruction projects restarted across the country. Electricity and water services improved in urban areas. Iraqi security forces expanded their responsibilities. Training programs strengthened army capabilities. Police forces increased patrols in local communities. Coalition troops shifted into support roles. Iraqi forces led more independent operations. Confidence in national security slowly improved. However, political divisions remained unresolved. Sectarian mistrust still divided communities. Power-sharing agreements faced repeated delays. Corruption weakened public confidence. Militia influence remained strong in some regions. Iranian influence grew among Shia political groups. Sunni communities feared marginalization. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, U.S. leaders evaluated long-term plans. The American public increasingly favored withdrawal. War fatigue had grown after years of conflict. Financial costs exceeded hundreds of billions of dollars. Military families endured repeated deployments. Political pressure for troop reduction intensified. Negotiations began between the U.S. and Iraqi government. A status of forces agreement was discussed. The agreement defined timelines for withdrawal. Iraqi leaders sought full sovereignty restoration. In 2008, a withdrawal framework was approved. U.S. combat troops would gradually leave Iraqi cities. Iraqi forces would assume internal security duties. Coalition bases began transferring control. American flags were lowered at some facilities. Iraqi commanders took operational leadership. Joint patrols became less frequent. Security responsibility transitioned district by district. Some regions remained unstable. Insurgent cells continued sporadic attacks. Suicide bombings still occurred in crowded areas. Extremist groups attempted to regain relevance. However, their operational strength was weakened. Al-Qaeda in Iraq struggled to rebuild networks. Many leaders had been captured or killed. Funding streams were disrupted. Recruitment numbers declined. Border security improved monitoring of foreign fighters. Iraq experienced cautious optimism. Families displaced by violence began returning home. Housing shortages created new challenges. Infrastructure damage required long-term rebuilding. International investors watched developments carefully. Economic recovery remained fragile. Oil production slowly increased. Revenue offered hope for national rebuilding. Still, unemployment remained high. Youth frustration posed future risks. Political rivalries delayed key reforms. Stability depended on continued cooperation. U.S. troop levels gradually declined. Combat missions became less frequent. Training and advisory roles expanded. Iraqi forces prepared to stand independently. Security improvements were real, but fragile. Analysts warned violence could return. Extremist ideology had not disappeared. Regional tensions continued influencing Iraq's future. The withdrawal marked a major transition. America's longest Iraq deployment was nearing its end, yet the war on terror was far from over.
While Iraq saw declining violence, Afghanistan grew more unstable. Taliban fighters had regrouped across rural regions. Insurgent attacks increased each year after 2006. Afghan government control weakened outside major cities. NATO forces faced growing resistance. Insurgents relied on guerrilla warfare tactics. Hit-and-run attacks became more frequent. Roadside bombs caused rising casualties. Improvised explosive devices became the leading threat. Patrol routes turned into deadly corridors. Taliban fighters used local terrain to their advantage. Mountain passes offered natural defensive positions. Insurgents blended into civilian populations. Identifying fighters became increasingly difficult. Night attacks targeted remote outposts. Coalition bases faced rocket and mortar fire. Supply convoys were ambushed along highways. Afghan police checkpoints were frequent targets. Civilian casualties fueled public resentment. Taliban propaganda exploited civilian suffering. They portrayed foreign forces as occupiers. Recruitment efforts intensified in rural communities. Poverty and unemployment fueled insurgent enlistment. Cross-border sanctuaries strengthened Taliban operations. Fighters retreated into Pakistan's tribal areas. Pursuit across the border remained politically sensitive. NATO commanders warned of worsening security. Insurgent influence expanded in southern Afghanistan. Helmand Province became a major battleground. British troops engaged in heavy fighting there. Canadian forces faced intense combat in Kandahar. U.S. troops reinforced vulnerable districts. Military leaders warned of a potential strategic failure. In 2009, a new U.S. administration reassessed the war. President Barack Obama ordered a strategy review. Commanders requested additional troops. Intelligence reports warned Taliban momentum was growing. A troop surge was approved for Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of additional U.S. troops deployed. NATO allies also increased contributions. The surge aimed to secure population centers, protect civilians, and weaken insurgent networks. Counterinsurgency tactics became the primary strategy. Troops moved into villages instead of large bases. Building trust with local communities became essential. Reconstruction projects accompanied security operations. Roads, schools, and clinics were rebuilt. Development efforts aimed to win local support. Afghan National Army recruitment expanded. Training programs intensified nationwide. Afghan police forces received international support. Progress remained uneven across regions. Some districts improved security conditions. Others remained contested battle zones. Night raids targeted Taliban leadership. Special operations forces captured key insurgent commanders. Intelligence gathering improved operational effectiveness. Drone surveillance increased across conflict areas. Precision strikes targeted militant hideouts. Taliban fighters adapted to avoid detection. They reduced electronic communications. Couriers carried messages between commanders. Insurgents avoided large gatherings. Despite pressure, insurgent attacks continued. Suicide bombings struck government offices. Urban attacks spread fear in major cities. Kabul experienced high-profile assaults. Afghan civilians remained caught in the conflict. Progress was measured but fragile. Corruption weakened public trust in government institutions. Taliban courts offered swift local justice. Some villages turned to insurgents for dispute resolution. Winning public confidence remained difficult. Military success alone could not ensure stability. The war demanded political and social solutions. NATO forces faced mounting costs and casualties. Public support in allied countries declined. Questions grew about the war's long-term viability. Afghanistan remained the longest war in U.S. history.
Nearly a decade after September 11th, Osama bin Laden remained at large. The world's most wanted man had evaded capture since 2001. Intelligence agencies continued tracking his network. Captured militants provided fragments of information. Couriers were identified as key communication links. Bin Laden avoided phones and the internet. Messages traveled through trusted messengers. U.S. intelligence focused on tracking these couriers. One courier drew particular attention. He used the alias Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Years of surveillance tracked his movements. He traveled between Pakistan's major cities. Analysts suspected he led them to bin Laden. In 2010, surveillance followed him to Abbottabad, Pakistan. Abbottabad was a military town near Pakistan's capital. The compound he visited raised immediate suspicion. It had unusually high walls topped with barbed wire. Security cameras were absent. Trash was burned instead of collected. Residents avoided contact with neighbors. The property had no internet or phone lines. Analysts believed a high-value target was inside. CIA surveillance intensified around the compound. Drones monitored activity from above. Satellite imagery tracked movement patterns. A tall man was observed walking inside the courtyard. He was nicknamed the Pacer. His identity could not be confirmed. Intelligence analysts debated the evidence. Some believed bin Laden was hiding there. Others warned the evidence was inconclusive. The decision carried enormous risk. A failed operation could cause international crisis. Pakistan had not been informed. The mission required absolute secrecy. President Barack Obama reviewed the intelligence. Advisors debated options for action. Airstrikes risked destroying evidence. A ground raid offered confirmation. Special operations forces began preparing. Navy SEAL Team 6 was selected for the mission. Pilots trained on a replica of the compound. Night rehearsals simulated possible scenarios. Stealth helicopters were modified for the operation. The mission was named Operation Neptune Spear. On May 1, 2011, the operation was approved. Under darkness, helicopters crossed into Pakistan. The team approached Abbottabad undetected. One helicopter experienced a hard landing inside the compound. The team quickly adapted to the situation. SEALs entered the compound on foot. They cleared buildings room by room. Resistance was encountered inside. Armed occupants were engaged. Women and children were moved to safety. The team advanced to the upper floors. In a third-floor room, they found bin Laden. He was shot and killed during the operation. His identity was confirmed using facial recognition. DNA samples were collected for verification. Sensitive documents and computer drives were seized. Intelligence materials filled multiple storage devices. The team prepared to exit quickly. The damaged helicopter was destroyed to protect secrets. SEALs departed with the recovered materials. The operation lasted approximately 40 minutes. The team returned safely to Afghanistan. DNA confirmation verified bin Laden's identity. His death marked a major milestone in the war on terror. The news was announced to the world. Crowds gathered outside the White House in celebration. Americans marked a moment of justice. World leaders responded to the announcement. Some warned the fight against terrorism was not over. Al-Qaeda vowed retaliation. Security alerts increased globally. Intelligence analysts examined seized documents. The materials revealed operational plans and contacts. The network had been weakened but not eliminated. The war on terror continued beyond bin Laden's death.
Have you ever wondered how a group like ISIS could suddenly appear and take over vast territories in the Middle East? To really understand it, we need to go back to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The fall of Saddam Hussein's government created a massive power vacuum. The old Iraqi army was disbanded, leaving thousands of trained soldiers unemployed and angry. This created a fertile ground for insurgency. Among the chaos, a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, emerged, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Their goal was to fight the US-led coalition forces and stir up a sectarian civil war between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Zarqawi was ruthless, and his tactics were brutal, even for Al-Qaeda. After his death in 2006, the group was weakened by the US surge and a Sunni tribal movement called the Anbar Awakening. But it never completely disappeared. It just went underground, waiting for its next opportunity. That opportunity came with the Syrian civil war in 2011. The conflict created another chaotic, lawless environment perfect for extremist groups to thrive. By then, the QI had rebranded itself and was led by a new figure, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He saw Syria as a golden chance to expand. He sent his fighters across the border, and they quickly established a foothold, taking advantage of the instability and grievances of the local Sunni population against Bashar al-Assad's regime. This is where the group started to transform. They merged with Syrian militant factions and renamed themselves the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This move caused a major split with Al-Qaeda's central leadership, who saw al-Baghdadi as too ambitious and extreme. But al-Baghdadi didn't care. he had a bigger vision. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which focused on global attacks, ISIS wanted to establish a physical state, a caliphate, governed by its harsh interpretation of Islamic law. Their breakthrough moment came in the summer of 2014. In a shocking blitz, ISIS fighters swept across northern Iraq. They captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, with surprising ease. The Iraqi army, which the US had spent billions training, seemed to just melt away. It was a huge psychological victory for ISIS. They seized massive amounts of weapons, cash from banks, and oil fields, becoming one of the richest and best-equipped terrorist organizations in history. From their new capital in Raqqa, Syria, they declared the re-establishment of the caliphate, with al-Baghdadi as its caliph. This declaration was a powerful recruiting tool. It attracted tens of thousands of foreign fighters from all over the world, drawn by the promise of living in a supposed Islamic utopia or the thrill of battle. ISIS mastered social media, producing slick propaganda videos that glorified their violence and showcased their state-building efforts. They presented themselves not just as a militant group, but as a functioning government with its own courts, taxes, and public services. The world was horrified by their brutality, which they broadcasted for everyone to see. Mass executions, beheadings, and the enslavement of minorities like the Yazidis became their trademark. This extreme violence was a deliberate strategy, designed to terrorize their enemies and project an image of unstoppable power. The rise of ISIS triggered a massive international response. A US-led coalition began an air campaign, bombing ISIS targets in both Iraq and Syria. On ground, the fight was led by a diverse mix of forces: the rebuilt Iraqi army, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, and various Syrian militias. It was a long, brutal, and bloody war. Cities like Mosul and Raqqa were reduced to rubble during the battles to liberate them. By 2017, the physical caliphate was crumbling. ISIS lost Mosul, then Raqqa, its two biggest prizes. In 2019, they were cornered in the small Syrian village of Baghouz, where they made their final stand. The fall of Baghouz marked the territorial defeat of the ISIS caliphate. Later that year, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in a US Special Forces raid. But does that mean ISIS is gone for good? Not exactly. While their dream of a state is over for now, the group has reverted to its insurgent roots. ISIS cells continue to carry out hit-and-run attacks and bombings in Iraq and Syria. They also have affiliates in other parts of the world, from Africa to Afghanistan, who continue to operate under their banner. The underlying issues that allowed ISIS to rise in the first place: political instability, sectarian tensions, and economic despair still exist in many parts of the region. The story of ISIS is a powerful lesson in how quickly chaos can be exploited, and a reminder that even when a group is defeated on the battlefield, its ideology can live on. Thanks for watching. If you found this explanation helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into complex world events. See you next time.
By 2014, ISIS controlled vast territory across Iraq and Syria. Millions of civilians lived under its rule. The group controlled major cities, oil fields, and highways. Their rapid expansion shocked world leaders. A new international coalition formed to defeat ISIS. The United States led the coalition effort. Dozens of nations contributed military support. Airstrikes began targeting ISIS positions. Command centers and training camps were destroyed. Oil facilities used to fund ISIS were bombed. Precision strikes weakened their supply networks. However, air power alone was not enough. Ground forces were needed to retake cities. Iraqi security forces began rebuilding strength. Kurdish fighters emerged as key allies. Kurdish Peshmerga forces defended northern Iraq. They halted ISIS advances toward Erbil. Kurdish units also rescued trapped civilians. One crisis unfolded on Mount Sinjar. Thousands of Yazidi civilians were stranded there. ISIS fighters surrounded the mountain. Many faced starvation and dehydration. Coalition airstrikes opened escape routes. Kurdish fighters helped evacuate survivors. The rescue operation gained global attention. Meanwhile, ISIS continued expanding in Syria. Kurdish forces defended the border city of Kobani. Heavy fighting erupted street by street. Coalition airstrikes supported Kurdish defenders. Months of combat reduced ISIS momentum. Kobani became a symbol of resistance. ISIS suffered heavy losses. Coalition strategy focused on isolating ISIS strongholds. Supply routes were targeted repeatedly. Foreign fighter travel networks were disrupted. Intelligence agencies tracked recruitment pipelines. Social media accounts linked to ISIS were removed. Counter-terror operations expanded worldwide. In Iraq, the battle to retake Mosul began. Mosul was ISIS's largest stronghold. Iraqi forces launched a major offensive in 2016. Kurdish forces supported the advance. Coalition aircraft provided air support. ISIS fighters fortified the city with tunnels and traps. Improvised explosives lined streets and buildings. Snipers targeted advancing troops. Civilians were used as human shields. Fighting moved block by block. The battle lasted for months. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Iraqi forces slowly regained control. In 2017, Mosul was declared liberated. ISIS suffered a major strategic defeat. Meanwhile, in Syria, Raqqa remained the ISIS capital. Syrian Democratic Forces launched an assault. Coalition airstrikes supported the operation. Urban combat devastated the city. ISIS resistance remained fierce. Fighters used tunnels to move unseen. Suicide bombers targeted advancing troops. After months of combat, Raqqa fell in 2017. ISIS lost its de facto capital. The collapse weakened the caliphate. Remaining fighters retreated into desert regions. ISIS shifted from territorial control to insurgency. Sleeper cells began launching surprise attacks. Lone wolf attacks inspired by ISIS spread globally. Cities in Europe experienced terrorist attacks. Security forces increased counter-terror operations. Intelligence sharing between nations improved. ISIS propaganda encouraged attacks abroad. Online radicalization became a growing threat. Though weakened, ISIS remained dangerous. Its ideology continued spreading worldwide. Coalition forces continued targeting remaining cells. The territorial caliphate was collapsing. But the extremist movement had not disappeared. The fight shifted from battlefield to global security. The war on terror entered a new phase. Victory against ISIS would require long-term vigilance. By 2018, ISIS had lost most of its territory. Coalition forces pushed fighters into remote desert areas. Remaining strongholds were surrounded and isolated. ISIS no longer controlled major cities. Its self-declared caliphate was collapsing. Fighters retreated into rural villages and deserts. Sleeper cells began replacing frontline armies. Insurgent tactics returned to the forefront. Surprise attacks targeted checkpoints and patrols. Roadside bombs reappeared across former battle zones. Civilians feared renewed instability. Refugees cautiously began returning home. Many cities lay in ruins after years of war. Infrastructure damage slowed rebuilding efforts. International aid groups began reconstruction programs. Removing unexploded bombs became a priority. Hidden explosives posed deadly risks to civilians. Schools and hospitals required rebuilding. Water and electricity systems remained unreliable. Economic recovery proved slow and difficult. Meanwhile, ISIS leadership operated in hiding. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi remained the group's leader. Intelligence agencies intensified efforts to locate him. Captured militants provided valuable clues. Surveillance tracked ISIS couriers and safe houses. Coalition forces conducted raids on suspected hideouts. Night operations targeted senior commanders. Still, al-Baghdadi remained elusive. ISIS propaganda continued encouraging global attacks. Supporters were urged to act independently. Lone actor attacks remained a major concern. Security agencies monitored extremist networks online. Intelligence sharing increased among allied nations. In 2019, new intelligence located al-Baghdadi in Syria. He was hiding in Idlib province. The location was confirmed through surveillance. US Special Operations Forces prepared a raid. The mission required secrecy and precision. Helicopters carried commandos under cover of darkness. The operation targeted a remote compound. Troops secured the perimeter upon arrival. Residents were evacuated for safety. Commandos entered the compound. Al-Baghdadi attempted to flee through tunnels. He detonated an explosive vest. The explosion killed him and 2 children. His death was confirmed through DNA testing. The mission marked a major symbolic victory. World leaders responded to the announcement. Many called it a turning point against ISIS. ISIS quickly named a new leader. The group shifted further into underground operations. Cells remained active in Iraq and Syria. Fighters hid among civilian populations. Desert regions became insurgent safe havens. Coalition forces continued counter-terror operations. Drone surveillance monitored militant movements. Precision strikes targeted remaining leaders. Local forces conducted security sweeps. ISIS attacks became smaller but unpredictable. Roadside bombs and ambushes continued. Prisons holding ISIS fighters became security concerns. Thousands of captured militants remained detained. Camps housing displaced families faced overcrowding. Radicalization risks grew inside detention camps. International efforts sought long-term solutions. Rebuilding war-torn regions required years of work. Communities struggled to recover from trauma. Survivors faced psychological scars of war. Cultural heritage sites required restoration. Economic recovery remained fragile. Despite losses, ISIS ideology persisted. Extremist messaging continued online. Security agencies remained on high alert. The fall of territory did not end the threat. The battlefield shifted from land to ideology. The war on terror entered a new era. Vigilance remained essential for global security.
August 2021. The world watched, breathless, as history turned a page in Afghanistan. After 2 decades, America's longest war was coming to a chaotic and heartbreaking end. This is the story of the final days, the fall of Kabul, and the human lives caught in the maelstrom. For 20 years, the war in Afghanistan was a backdrop to our lives, a distant conflict, punctuated by headlines and policy debates. It began in the shadow of 9/11's, a mission to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. A generation of soldiers, diplomats, and aid workers poured their efforts into building a new Afghanistan. Schools were opened, women entered public life, and a fragile democracy took root. But underneath, the foundations remained unstable. The decision to withdraw U.S. troops had been years in the making, spanning multiple administrations. By the spring of 2021, the final deadline was set. The plan was for an orderly transition, handing over security to the Afghan National Army, a force trained and equipped by the U.S. and its allies at a cost of billions. The official narrative was one of confidence. Afghan forces were believed to be capable of holding their ground, but reality on the ground told a different story. As American forces packed up and left key bases, often in the dead of night, a vacuum of power was created. The Taliban, who had been waiting in the wings, began a lightning-fast offensive. Province after province fell, often without a fight. The Afghan army, plagued by corruption, low morale, and a lack of critical U.S. air support, seemed to melt away. The speed of the collapse stunned observers around the globe. What was projected to take months, or at least weeks, was happening in a matter of days. The world's attention turned to Kabul, the capital. It was the last bastion of the Afghan government, a sprawling city teeming with millions of residents and hundreds of thousands of displaced people who had fled the Taliban as advance, hoping for safety. The atmosphere was thick with fear and uncertainty. Rumors flew. Banks were swarmed as people tried to withdraw their life savings. Embassies began frantic evacuations. For the people of Kabul, life had become a countdown. Then came August 15th, the day the dam broke. Taliban fighters entered the outskirts of the city. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The presidential palace was occupied. The government had vanished. Just like that, Kabul had fallen. The 20-year project was over. What followed was a scene of pure desperation at Hamid Karzai International Airport. It became the world's only window into Afghanistan and the only escape route. Thousands upon thousands of Afghans, terrified of what a return to Taliban rule would mean, flooded the runways. They were interpreters, journalists, women's rights activists, former government employees, and ordinary families who had bet their futures on the promise of a different Afghanistan. The images from the airport are seared into our collective memory. people clinging to the sides of departing U.S. military planes. Parents passing their babies over razor wire fences to soldiers, hoping to give them a chance at a life they could no longer have. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. The evacuation efforts, led by the U.S. and other nations, were a race against time, trying to pull as many people out as possible before the final withdrawal deadline of August 31st. The effort was heroic, but fraught with danger. On August 26th, the chaos was shattered by a suicide bombing at the airport's Abbey Gate carried out by ISIS-K, a rival extremist group. The attack killed 13 U.S. service members and over 170 Afghans. It was a final, brutal blow in a war defined by tragedy. By August 31st, the last U.S. military plane was airborne. The withdrawal was complete. In its wake, a new reality set in for Afghanistan. The Taliban were back in power, reimposing their strict interpretation of Islamic law. The gains made in women's rights over 2 decades were rapidly reversed. Girls were barred from secondary education. Women were pushed out of the workforce and public life. The vibrant, hopeful society that had begun to blossom was forced back into the shadows. The economic collapse was just as swift. With foreign aid cut off and international assets frozen, the country plunged into a severe humanitarian crisis. Millions faced starvation. The healthcare system buckled. Afghanistan became a nation of immense suffering, largely forgotten by the world once the dramatic evacuation scenes faded from the news cycle. Looking back, the questions are profound and painful. Was it all for nothing? What was the true cost of these 2 decades of intervention? The soldiers who served, the civilians who died, the families who were torn apart. The fall of Kabul wasn't just a political failure. It was a human tragedy on a massive scale. It exposed the limits of military power and the profound difficulty of nation building. The story of Afghanistan is far from over. Its people continue to navigate a life of hardship and uncertainty with incredible resilience. Their future remains unwritten. The final days of the war serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of conflict, the fragility of progress, and the enduring human spirit that persists even in the darkest of times. The world may have turned its attention elsewhere, but for the people of Afghanistan, the struggle for survival, dignity, and freedom continues every single day. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it. Subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shape our world.
After 2 decades of conflict, the war on terror entered a new phase. Large-scale invasions were replaced by targeted counter-terror operations. Military strategy shifted toward precision strikes and intelligence missions. Drone surveillance became a central tool in counter-terror efforts. Special operations forces continued global missions. Terrorist networks adapted to avoid detection. Decentralized cells replaced large training camps. Extremist groups relied on encrypted communication. Online radicalization emerged as a major security threat. Social media became a recruitment battlefield. Lone actor attacks increased in several countries. Security agencies expanded cyber monitoring capabilities. Intelligence sharing between nations improved significantly. International cooperation became essential for prevention. ISIS lost its territorial caliphate but remained active. Sleeper cells continued attacks in Iraq and Syria. ISIS affiliates expanded into Africa and Asia. Regions of instability became recruitment grounds. Extremist violence spread into the Sahel region of Africa. Militants exploited weak governance and poverty. Boko Haram and ISIS affiliates expanded operations. Terror threats evolved beyond the Middle East. Afghanistan remained a security concern. ISIS-K carried out deadly attacks within the country. Taliban forces fought to maintain internal control. Global powers monitored developments cautiously. Counter-terror operations continued without permanent occupation. Airstrikes targeted high-value terrorist leaders. Intelligence-based operations replaced large troop deployments. Governments prioritized homeland security measures. Airport and border security systems were strengthened. Passenger screening technologies improved. Surveillance systems expanded in major cities. Counter-terror laws increased law enforcement powers. Critics raised concerns about privacy and civil liberties. The balance between security and freedom became a global debate. Veterans returned home carrying physical and emotional scars. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress. Nations invested more in veteran support programs. War memorials honored those who served and sacrificed. Families continued coping with long-term loss. The financial cost of the war reshaped national budgets. Trillions of dollars were spent over 2 decades. Resources were diverted from domestic priorities. Analysts debated the long-term economic impact. The wars reshaped global alliances. NATO strengthened counter-terror cooperation. Intelligence partnerships expanded worldwide. Middle Eastern geopolitics shifted significantly. Regional rivalries intensified in power vacuums. Iran expanded influence in Iraq and Syria. Russia increased military involvement in Syria. China observed conflicts while expanding global influence. Terrorism remained a persistent global challenge. Extremist ideology continued spreading online. Counter-radicalization programs gained importance. Education and community outreach became prevention tools. Governments focused on disrupting recruitment pipelines. Technology companies worked to remove extremist content. Artificial intelligence began assisting threat detection. The nature of warfare evolved in the digital age. Cyber warfare and information warfare became new fronts. Future conflicts may rely less on conventional armies. The war on terror reshaped military doctrine. Nations learned the limits of military force alone. Stability requires political, economic, and social solutions. Rebuilding war-torn regions takes generations. Trauma and displacement leave lasting scars. Entire generations grew up knowing only conflict. Yet global cooperation against terrorism improved. Intelligence networks are stronger than ever before. Rapid response capabilities have expanded worldwide. The threat remains, but preparedness has increased. The war on terror changed how nations fight threats. It changed how societies balance freedom and security. It reshaped global politics and military strategy. It left lessons written in sacrifice and history. The world today is safer in some ways, and more complex in others. The fight against extremism continues in new forms. The story of the war on terror is still being written.